In Matthew 24, Jesus gave his famous last discourse on the things of the future, particularly in response to the very good question from the disciples who said to him, "What will be the sign of your parousia, your second coming?" One event, by the way, not two. "Of your parousia and of the end of the age," not the end of the world, certainly not the end of time, but the end of the present age. What will be the sign of that great event? Jesus then spoke of the temple. In fact, the temple was the subject of his discourse, and he said that the temple would be corrupted, would be destroyed, in fact. He then said that that event would be triggered, that terrible destruction, corrupting at least, defilement of the temple, would be triggered by the appearance of what he called the abomination of desolation. In Mark's version, we have a very interesting grammatical fact that needs to be taken note of everywhere. That is, in Mark 13:14, he spoke of the abomination of desolation. Daniel referred to it as the abomination of desolation, obviously. Mark then reports Jesus as saying that this abomination of desolation will be standing where he, a masculine pronoun, where he, so it's a person or an image of a person, where he ought not to. Matthew calls this a holy place, and Daniel clearly envisages a temple, because it says that this awful event, the appearance of the abomination of desolation where he ought not to be, will trigger the time of intense affliction, trouble, tribulation, such as has not occurred since the foundation of the world. Now, if we then apply that to AD 70, we arrive at an impossible jumble and confusion. Let's think about that. If we say that Jesus is here talking about an event in 70 AD, where supposedly Titus or a Roman general or other person interfered with the temple, if you insist that Jesus must be talking about that event, what kind of muddle do we arrive at? An impossible muddle. Because Jesus, having said that the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to would trigger the time of greatest possible tribulation, the Great Tribulation, he then went on to say in Matthew 24:29 that immediately following that terrible event, immediately, not 2,000 years later, but immediately following that terrible event, the appearance of the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation, the sun would be darkened and he would appear in his great visible parousia. Incidentally, I must say that the Jehovah's Witnesses at your door are completely mistaken if they talk about an invisible event in 1914. That is no solution at all. It just puts the whole subject into utmost confusion. But if we look at the evangelical view sometimes, it's equally confusing, because that event cannot be 70 AD. Yes, of course, Jesus was talking about temple. But you see, in the Hebrew mind, a temple that you see in front of you can also be a temple which isn't yet built. We find that in the book of Haggai. They can speak of the temple, this temple in fact, meaning a temple that used to be there, and they can speak of this temple, meaning a building that isn't yet there. That's the very nice Hebrew grasping of totality idea. So once again, let me run the great muddle that many are in Matthew 24. Jesus spoke of an abomination, the abomination, Daniel's abomination, standing where he ought not to be. This will trigger the time of greatest tribulation, and immediately after that time, Jesus will reappear. Well, now think about that. If you're fixed on AD 70 as the locus and the timing indicated by Jesus there, you're simply in confusion. Because immediately after that event in 70 AD, Jesus did not come back. So then you are forced into the unenviable position of saying, well, the Great Tribulation must have lasted for 2,000 years, twice the length of the millennium. That's an impossibility. Absolute nonsense, in fact, because Mark says that those days of the Great Tribulation will be very tough for pregnant women and for nursing women. Is that really true of 2,000 years of Great Tribulation? Evidently not. This forces us then into saying that the Great Tribulation is yet future. In fact, in Daniel it obviously is, because it's found there in Daniel 12, verse 1. And immediately after that time of fearful, unprecedented, the time of Jacob's trouble, unprecedented trouble, Jesus will reappear in his single, splendid, visible parousia. He will gather the saints from all over the world. They will not have been raptured 7 years, obviously. Before that, that's just impossible. because they were told to flee to the hills, and he will then introduce the great age of the kingdom of God on earth.